ich dir noch angesäche, so bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschäche? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel Schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gab.
This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary holy land from the heathen. This is Dan Baltic.
And this is Matt Pegas.
And this is episode 73, I believe. And we are...
74. 74.
74. Okay, because it was a two-parter, the selective reading.
Right.
All right, so we are up to 74. And we are, very honored to be here with the maximum leader of the Worthy House, Charles Haywood, who is, the Worthy House, if you don't know, is a kind of compendium of book reviews, but also articles that you have, written in, on various topics, essays and such. And where you have also propounded a philosophy, or if not philosophy, a certain kind of map toward a post-liberal future called foundationalism, which is, a very interesting strategy indeed. And in general, on our side, you're a man who really needs no introduction. So, but I've went ahead and introduced you anyway. Good to have you on the pod, Charles.
Shockingly large number of people who have no idea who I am.
Yeah. So, maybe I'll just, yes, that's an introduction, but it might be instructive to kind of get into, you discussed this a bit with Last Things, but I thought it was neat, and I'd want to recap it a bit for our audience. The Worthy House is it's a very catchy name. It's an interesting name. And I believe it's a reference to T. Lawrence and an epigraph from his memoirs or something of that nature.
And though actually the original phrase comes from Proverbs. Lawrence stole it from.
Oh, there we go.
Stole it and modified it for use in his epigraph. But I took it from his epigraph. I actually did not know that it was from Proverbs until someone pointed that out to me, and then I modified the explanation on my own site, explaining it to make it look like I had always thought that and known that it was from Proverbs.
There we go. We'll keep it a secret.
Verse from Proverbs. I can look it up here. But
I would have to go look it up. I can't remember.
Yeah. Oh, no worries. Yeah.
So it is in Proverbs. Lawrence, of course, was an educated man, very interesting man, a troubled man, obviously. But back then, people were able to make references like that and assume that everyone got that. It wasn't like he was trying to rip off Proverbs. He was obviously expected people to get the reference. Nowadays, they just don't do it, including me, sadly. So that is where the reference, the Worthy House, comes from. I just was looking for a name for the site, and I couldn't come up with something. And I had been reading Lawrence's autobiography, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and his somewhat unreliable narrator autobiography, but nonetheless an excellent book. And I was in Key West, of all places, on a Disney cruise. This was back before it became completely anathema to all right-thinking people, and I had the thought, so I stuck with that.
Interesting.
It's a great name, and LT Last Things made the point that it was apparently unintentional, but it seems to create a kind of automatic or intuitive counterpoint to the Longhouse.
Yes.
And I really like that, because what's the difference between a Longhouse? Well, the opposite, I suppose, would be a house that is worthy, a house that elevates, that yeah. So it's
and most assuredly, the worthy house is opposed to the long house. It certainly fits.
The worthy house has many stories. It is not long. It is tall. It is monumental, shall we say?
Yes, lots of book reviews. As I like to say, the book reviews tend to be my own thoughts masquerading as book reviews, though I do usually, they're not 100% of the time, but almost all the time, say quite a bit about the book itself. So they do have a dual purpose. And the reason I started doing that, I started writing book reviews because I couldn't remember anything I had read. So I started writing down my thoughts on the books, and then that was kind of expanded over time.
No,
Absolutely.
I can certainly vibe with that. Like a lot of writing that I end up doing, at least nonfiction, obviously, is a book review or maybe something that I weave together based on multiple things I read. Not to sound like a lefty college professor or something, but I do think reading itself can be a creative act. I think that your response to the book, you're always engaged in like a dialectical process of interpretation, which is creative, and that's where the birth of a lot of great thoughts.
Well, I think there's two things that kind of flow from that. First of all, after a while, I stopped doing books that I knew I would hate. As I stopped doing just to trash them. Like I'm not going to read, I don't know, Hunter Biden's autobiography if he has an autobiography, because that just would be a waste of my time. I mean, it's amusing to trash books, but it's kind of a waste of time. There may be rare exceptions to that, but I haven't done one of those for a couple of years. The last one I did was, I think, September 2020, and I announced that was my last one. And then it also means, on the negative side, I think, that you tend to kind of, I don't want to repeat myself. So I tend to, the reviews, or the need to do reviews, tends to drive the reading selections, which may or may not really be good, because then you're foreclosing some books that maybe you would really want to read or find interesting, because you're like, well, my readers, if I'm going to review this, don't want to have another book review about, I don't know, the Peloponnesian War or something. Not that I have any about the Peloponnesian War, but you don't want to repeat yourself either in terms of the substance of the books you're covering or in the thoughts you have that relate to them. So it does become a little bit of a constraining thing over time. I'm not sure how that's going to develop in the future, but one step at a time.
One of the things I really like about it is that, so like we on New Right, we platform authors and creators in the kind of dissident space, the our guys space, whatever you want to call it. But that is kind of like, as you say, that's, friendly. We certainly don't want to be too critical of anyone. And as a result, we don't touch upon, mainstream books, really. And we, I mean, sometimes we do. That's not fair to us, Matt. But we sometimes touch upon. But generally, the people we have on are not, are writers from this space. And, we are having certain types of conversations with them. And I think there's definitely an interest. And there's an interest in, for me, certainly in reading your reviews to get a kind of based perspective on literature and books and what have you, that is not necessarily about cultivating authors from our space, but about applying a kind of critical lens toward books that are important. And whether they're important for good reasons or bad reasons, you seem to now be more tending toward discussing books that are important for good reasons. It's good to have that type of voice out there, and that resource, frankly, because I mean, in prepping for this episode, I was familiar with the Worthy House, but I did not realize quite so many, that you had reviewed quite so many books.
Yes,
and it's really quite impressive. I personally have not read that many books over the past 2 or 3 years. So
I've slowed down a bit. I think my greatest output was like 80 reviews in a year, which was like 2019. But they've also gotten longer and more detailed and more woven into each other. So that's my excuse. I used to do some very short reviews, and now pretty much they all hover around 3,000 to 4,000 words. So, I mean, which comes out in audio to about 25 minutes, which people seem to think is a pretty good length of time. I mean, you don't want to, there's a couple that go like an hour and a half. That's probably more than most people want. So I try to avoid that whenever possible.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this kind of naturally leads itself to the thing I outlined next, which is the role that, because so, I mean, obviously this project, I mean, I'm sure it didn't predate your politics, but this is kind of the first kind of creative project that you seem to have undertook in this space. And so you must believe, and stop me if I'm putting words in your mouth, of course, but you must believe that literature plays a role in whatever movement or thing we have here. And if we're going to call it a culture war, I mean, we certainly believe that literature plays an important part in the culture war. So we're wondering on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's true at a couple levels. I think even before you get to kind of the culture war, both fiction and nonfiction literature, and this up until very recently was universally recognized, but both fiction and nonfiction literature play crucial parts in the formation both of people and of societies. So nonfiction is kind of obvious. You learn history and political theory and political philosophy and generic philosophy, whatever it may be, in a way that's simply impossible otherwise. But I think the thing that people have lost even more than that, if such a thing is possible, as they get their history from Chat GPT or whatever, is that my mother used to tell me this when I was a small child. The point of great literature is to understand the nature of human beings, and that you can only get that through two ways: great literature that exemplifies an understanding of how human beings are, and personal interaction with other human beings. So in a sense, it's even more important now that you do reading for that reason, because everyone's online, and online interactions are simply not the same thing. And obviously, totally aside from online, many people are alone and don't have any friends, yada, yada, all the problems that people hear about and see. So great literature allows people to become fully rounded human beings, but now people do neither. They don't get the nonfiction, they don't get the fiction. So it's important for that reason from a culture war perspective, because being right wing is reality has a right wing bias. And so if you read just standard literature that has no political component, you obviously, you just necessarily tend to become more right wing. I mean, this is a universal truth. I mean, I suppose that's probably not true if you read certain, say, early 20th century agitprop like The Grapes of Wrath or something like that. But I mean, that's not really great literature. It's like Hemingway. I mean, Hemingway sucks. I mean, he's just awful. Totally aside from the tendentious, pro-communist propaganda, he's just not a good writer. Not that I'm a good writer. I'm terrible at writing fiction, but Hemingway just objectively is a bad writer. And so if anybody who reads just a random selection of literature, fiction or nonfiction from the past 500 years or 2,000 years, but is it widely available literature, say 500 years, is whatever. Past literature is automatically highly likely to move in a right-wing direction, which of course is one of the reasons that people don't want it.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the same time, obviously, there's a direct culture war thing. That is, you have people, like you work on this. Passage Press works on this. The idea of bringing out new works that are specifically designed to create a cultural renaissance that has a right-wing drift. And so these things interlock with each other. They kind of dovetail together as a project. I mean, this is a somewhat nascent project, and also involves things like artistic endeavors and so on. And it's difficult, of course, because there's no money for it. And so that's its own set of problems. But I'm very encouraged by both of these things. That is, people's tendency to focus on older literature and the production of new literature and art.
Yeah, I'm kind of reminded / inspired in what you just said. I'm imagining like a bell curve meme a little bit, where I agree with your basic point that I think there is what I would call not even necessarily a right wing, but it's, broader, more transcendental of the mere political spectrum, a more like faction of truth element to literature traditionally. I think that I have been thinking about this kind of, we were coming off doing this 2-part episode on Kosta Alamaryu's Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, which I wouldn't I imagine that could be an eventual Worthy House title.
Yeah, no, I have a copy, obviously, but I haven't got. I mean,
Well,
the list is long.
of course, it's always long, but I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that one. But I think without rehashing everything from that, those 2 episodes we did, I think that one of the truth pills in that book is about how high culture, philosophy, it would extend to literature and fiction as well, is very much the product of these kind of more hierarchical societies. It's the product of a luxury class.
Yes.
And so I think within that, there is this, and even deeper than that, a luxury class founded on, truthful principles, which we could call right wing in the sense that they're censored by the left wing, facts of biology, etc. In Kostin's book, he talks about selective breeding. We don't need to get down that rabbit hole, but it's all part and parcel of this realm of what would now be called right wing thought. But I bring up the bell curve meme because I think there's this funny thing where in America, especially, and maybe in Europe as well, for the past 100, 200 years, there's there was for a while at least a drift towards kind of associating literature and academia, rightfully so, with leftist thought. And you have novelists like Hemingway, and obviously academia is kind of beyond the pale in terms of how leftist it is. I kind of view that as the emergence of, again, not to wax too Bappian, but the province of the kind of striver class of men, the striver class of men of letters, shall we say. At some point, literature became about sort of staking your claim, and
it's tied at some level to mass democracy.
Yeah, definitely. Which again, we can have nuanced takes on these things. I'm not saying all of it is bad, and that
I think the important thing to remember from the perspective of the project is that one of the lies that's kind of a pillar of the modern left project is this idea that clever, culturally au courant people, artists, are inherently left wing. It's related to the myth that the total myth that the boomers created, that the younger generation always rebels against the morals and politics of their parents. Both those things are objectively, historically, totally false. Historically, artists typically work for the people who pay them. And when you have a society of as you have traditionally, of the ruling class being right wing, the artists are right wing, and not just because they're pleasing their patrons. So there's obviously an element of that, but this idea that somehow artists are inherently subversive and tilted left is just historically overtly false. But yet we're told this as some kind of factoid that's obvious. That's strictly a 20th century phenomenon and based upon the temporary success of the left in the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I think a good
for reality. Go on, Dan. Sorry.
I mean, I was going to say, I think a good kind of heuristic for this is artists, generally, I mean, obviously they, create fictions, but regardless, the goal of art is in some sense to convey a sort of truth. And as Matt was mentioning, the faction of truth, well, currently and historically has been on the right. And so if you are attempting to convey truth, and that is really what art is on, some deep level, certain truths, maybe truths that have been suppressed, et cetera, but that goes part and parcel with right-wing thought, because I mean the left is imagining and extrapolating based on those imaginings, ideals. We all know what's going on. So any return to the classics is a return, certainly from the perspective of the current left, to right-wing thought. But I mean, truly to some form of right-wing thought, like even to go to anyone pre-war. I mean, you're going to find a perspective that, certainly would offend those on the left today, and that hews closer to reality than anything you're going to read from a Pulitzer winner or a Pushcart winner, whatever these, literary prizes are these days.
Right. Yeah, I mean, no one who matters pays attention to any of those literary prizes anymore, because they're silly exercises in leftist self-congratulation. I mean, it's like the the Oscars, the Academy Awards. I mean, why would
Mhm.
anyone pay attention to that at all? It's just, and that, of course, I mean, this is a truism, or no, truism, the wrong word. It's something that many people comment on, which is that gives opportunity, because when the old ways and modes and orders decay, there's room for people to create substitutes. If the left hadn't distorted all these things but kept them more mainstream, there would be less opportunity for people on the right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I, obviously we appreciate, the shout out and obviously the Passage Prize as well. I do think we're kind of involved in this and you are too, of course, Charles, and many people on our sphere. This project of kind of trying to recreate, the literature of the faction of truth. I won't take too much credit, not only because there's so many other people involved, but also I still think this thing is very much in its infancy. But I like to see where it's going, and I would add, like, it's because we are excluded from the mainstream element of it and these various publishing prizes. I think that the strength in that, and maybe you kind of articulated this a moment ago, the strength in that is that you get people who are writing things simply because this sounds a little corny, but they're writing things simply because they feel they must. There's this human drive both in fiction and nonfiction to express truth as you understand it. In our case, it's at a great degree of social risk, and at this point, very, very, very little monetary gain comes from it. We're kind of all just scrapping along, but there's a great strength, I think, and a great, it puts what you're working on more in line with the truth when you're not doing it to please somebody else, and I think that's one of the key pieces of the puzzle.
And I think, I mean, historically, the left got traction in the 20th century and late 19th century in these terms without having a lot of money. That is, they got money soon enough, but the fact is that the starving artist archetype is really one that is derived from leftists starving in the early and mid 20th century before they became the recipients of endless fonts of money. I mean, yeah, there was some rich people who would give money, but for the most part, rich people who were far left tended to give money to politicians, like Lenin, for example. Like famously, the Russian upper classes gave lots of money to the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, partially for ideological reasons and partially for basically don't eat me if you come to power kind of reasons. But artists typically have never been lavishly funded at the early inception of the left. So I don't think right-wing people can expect, unfortunately, that the teal bucks are going to start flowing down. But nonetheless, I also think that modern technology allows distribution and so on in a way that wasn't possible in the past, and that's certainly an advantage.
Right.
Absolutely. I think this kind of brings us to questions of the artistic economy, and to what extent do you think that we should, or it is valuable to focus on retrieving and reviving lost classics? So maybe the Mystery Grove model, if you will, versus cultivating new novels, new books, and we'll talk about some of those new books in a little bit. But I mean, I think there are two things that, and really there's everything that the current literary landscape is missing. But the true classics of the past are increasingly disfavored or buried. And new good work cannot take hold. So I think we kind of have these not exactly competing imperatives, but hopefully I would say complementary imperatives to preserve the past and cultivate future authors.
I think that's certainly true. I think the biggest problem on the former, that is the preserving of the past, is copyright law, because copyright law is so grossly excessively long, because Disney bought Congress. The vast majority of works that I think would be of particular relevance to the present moment are of the relatively recent past. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of great 1800s or 1700s works. It's like Carlyle. Yeah. Everyone says read Carlyle. I've never read any Carlyle. Don't plan to start. Sure, it's great, but I'm not sure that's really what's needed. I think there's probably a larger group of things from the 20th century that are important in this moment, and because they tend to be less philosophical and more historically based, as well as based upon the events of the actual 20th century, which is more germane to our present moment than, say, the 1700s, whatever some people may say. And the problem is the copyright law is weaponized. You see things in this, things like Camp of the Saints. I have a copy of Camp of the Saints, which I bought before books on Amazon in general became very expensive, and before, of course, the copyright system was weaponized against any book that might undermine the regime's narrative. The problem is that if you're not a pop-up, if you're an actual business, you can't be running around violating the copyright laws because they'll use that as a weapon against you. So that means that you only can republish a subset of important past works from not even the recent past, but copyright law is 90 years.
After before the 1920s generally.
Yeah. So that's a big problem. I don't really have a solution to that, but what you're going to do?
I mean, one of the interesting issues there is, I think, if you can find estates that have held on to the copyright and never gave it to the publishing company, that's very valuable. But I mean, that's probably few and far between. I mean, I know the custom now is like generally for the author to hold the copyright. But I honestly, I'm not familiar with what was customary in the 1930s and 40s, and very well.
It's like any personal property. So, but I mean, I think a lot of times you just can't find anybody who there's been no determination and it's ambiguous.
Yeah.
And so that means, of course, that if someone is looking to create a vector of attack on you, it's easy for them to say, come up with some relative who's funded to claim that's my copyright, and now you owe me all this money, and so on and so forth. So unless the copyright is clear, you can't take that risk. And so fundamentally, and if it is clear and a book starts getting traction because it's topical, again, like Camp of the Saints, you can be certain that the infinite money given to NGOs or whatever will be used to buy up that copyright.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, it should be stressed that copyright law is, vigorously enforced and, federal, in most cases, and can be very punitive. So it definitely discourages infringement from people who know what they're doing, the type of people who would be able to publish these books, because they know that they could wind up being liable for quite a lot of money.
And a well-run copyright system would be absolute 20 years from creation, maybe 15. That's it. But that's not what we have. I mean, so we used to have. That was where copyright started. But
yeah. Oh well. Yeah. So I thought it might be good to go from here to kind of dig into the artists and the writers of this scene, this kind of emerging right-wing literary scene. And so I specifically read and listened to your reviews of 3 authors who, I was going to say all of whom have been on the pod. That is not true. 2 of them have. The last one we hope to have on one day. And whose novels and books I think are emblematic of this emerging movement. So we have Breakfast with the Dirt Cult by Samuel Finley, an excellent novel and memoir of sorts of a soldier's love and life in Afghanistan and the United States and Bosnia as well. And Domestic Extremist by Peachy Keenan, a fellow Natal Conference attendee. It's a kind of, very well-written and rousing guide toward, in rejecting feminism and embracing a more domestic lifestyle for women. And there is good advice in there for men as well. And finally, a book that needs no introduction, but that could potentially be said to have, injected the vitality into this alternative literature community all by itself, Bronze Age Mindset.
Yes. So I've done reviews of all 3 of those. The last first, Bronze Age Mindset. I'm a big fan of BAP and in general. I mean, I have some quibbles with what I would generically mine is the pagan right, but since my basic philosophy is no enemies on the right, and I think there's a lot of virtue there, and plus it's just a funny book. I think my only real comment on Bronze Age mindset, because I assume a lot of people are familiar with it. Almost all the viewership. I think that was 5 or 6 years ago. Maybe I reviewed it. I think I would probably take a somewhat different take. That is, I think I was somewhat negative about things I would be positive about now. Because I say on my site that the shelf life of my opinions is 3 years. So if it's more than 3 years previous, I may well have changed my mind on a particular topic. I wouldn't change my mind overall because I was overall positive on Bronze Age mindset, but I think I was, I let some normie negativity creep into me in a way that I probably wouldn't nowadays. Certainly, the other two are good examples, I think, because they're the two halves of the same coin. They're both anti-feminist, one from the female perspective, one from the male perspective. I mean, Breakfast with the Dirt Cult, which I always want to call Breakfast with the Dirt Club. Breakfast with the Dirt Club. Sorry, there I go. Breakfast with the Dirt Club is not really a war memoir. I mean, the war is kind of backdrop to the story, as you say, of the protagonist, who's a stand-in for the author, presumably, or obviously, though whether it's 100% stand-in is not clear. But much of his life is ruined by feminism. And much of the lives of Afghans is ruined by feminism as well. Incompetent female pilots shooting children and what have you. And then, of course, Peachy Keenan's book, which is the most recent of those books, is I think the one ring to rule them all, Jeremiad against feminism and all its what's the phrase, the baptism phrase? Do you reject Satan and all his empty works and promises? So, the rejection of all the empty works and promises of feminism, rather than, I think, what's been much more common, even among people who are fairly far on the dissident right. Well, first wave feminism is okay, but I don't approve of this stuff that's happening lately. I mean, feminism from the 19th century is an abomination and which should have cut out root and branch. And you go back even further. Mary Harrington, in her excellent book, Feminism Against Progress, talks about this, how even in the 19th century, the model of the domestic relationship between men and women had been mutated by the Industrial Revolution. So you should actually not go back to like Jane Austen land, but to an earlier model, which Harrington talks about at some length. But all those books are, I think, excellent for the purposes of education for the young, and that's, I think, one of the primary goals of literature. That is, if you're a 15-year-old girl or boy who reads those books, you will be infinitely better off if you just read those 3 books. You will have learned about all the things that they're going to lie to you about. In fact, if you're going to a government school, have already been lying to you about for 10 years, but you'll learn that those things are lies in a way that communicates to you that they are lies, as opposed to having somebody yelling at you that they are lies, which, of course, is more effective than people let on. But literature is a more effective way, I think, to communicate that.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I think we kind of I think, Dan, you probably pulled those out for the outline, partially just because they're people that we've talked to or talked about a lot. But I also agree with what you were saying, Charles, that those 3 in particular, I think, go really well together as kind of forming a potentially holistic worldview, a truthful one. They all come from slightly different perspectives. Breakfast with the Dirt Cult's obviously a personal narrative. Peachy Keenan and Bap are as different. They're as different in as many ways as they are similar, I would say, but both kind of they're 2 sides of the same coin, sort of, as you said. Just to comment on a few things you said. To start with, I guess the earliest chronologically of those books, Breakfast with the Dirt Cult, which was written, I think, in like 2008 or 9. It's quite old. It's older than most of the books. It's kind of a prehistoric to this scene, but also influential upon it. I wanted to agree that it's not really. It is a war memoir, but it's also not. I think that was one of my big takeaways while reading it. Was I thought it was going to be a sort of modern day Ernst Jünger book, which in certain ways it is, and certainly that's one of the things that Bap praised it on when he had Finley on his podcast. But when you get to the end of it, you realize, no, this is actually a sort of coming of age book, and a lot of it's about romance and sexuality and the failures thereof, mostly because of feminism. What I was going to say was it's more like a Welbeck novel than anyone would realize looking at the cover or just reading the first half. It's kind of that somewhat sad but also enlightening look from the inside of the kind of ravages of progressive culture on today's modern man, shall we say.
Well, I think
yeah, go on.
Bronze Age mindset. I'll come back to Finlay's book in a second. I think if someone hasn't read Bronze Age mindset, you have to read it just for his redescription of Mitt Romney as Alcibiades.
Absolutely.
So if you do nothing else today, you should get that book and read that passage. But you should read the whole book. But Finlay's book was covers early 2000s, right? What, 2003 right. Maybe. And one of the interesting things to me about that book is we now are so used to race relations being poisoned by the left's anti-white hatred. But you see this, and this has always been true to some extent in the military, but you see a much easier set of race relations than you have now. You couldn't he describes things in the army, basically. And the line I always remember is that there's two guys in his platoon or his company that are one's a Puerto Rican and one's a Mexican migrant to California, and they're always razzing each other. And the Puerto Rican guy, he quotes him as saying something like, "Sexy Ricans are head and shoulders above you peasant spics." But like these people were friends with each other, right? And now you can't, all that kind of, what now would be called racism, but really is just an acknowledgement of racial differences, and that we're all in this together, has been totally destroyed by the left, which is really kind of unfortunate. But again,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I was also going to, sorry, I'll you get back to you in a second, Dan. Sorry. I was also going to comment with Bronze Age mindset for what you were saying about how your interview has you present it differently now. I think I just want to highlight that as an interesting element of Bronze Age mindset, how compared to a lot of other books in this scene, I guess Samuel Finley's book has had an interesting kind of reemergence too, but Bronze Age mindset has really stayed in the conversation now for 5 years, 5+ years, which is pretty amazing. And I think no matter what perspective one originally came to it from, I think everyone's perspective on it has evolved. So that's a testament to its power. I second what you're saying. I wholeheartedly, recommend Bronze Age mindset to literally anyone. I mean, even like normie and liberal friends. It's just an entertaining book, and it's actually quite, I think, fair in the way it presents things. It's not coming with a super strong, well, I suppose it has a point of view that's pretty clear, but it's so learned, I guess, deceptively so, because it's written in caveman. But like it's just one of those things that if you have anyone who's like kind of academically inclined, like that, it's the book I'd point to anyone to understand like this scene. Absolutely. And
staying power is a very important point. I mean, it is kind of amazing if you think about it, especially because maybe this contributes somewhat to the staying power, but the fact it gets attacked all the time, and that's something I think is good for the literature movement in general. These attacks don't really have any effect anymore, in any meaningful way, which I think is certainly a step forward.
Definitely. I was also going to ask if we can bracket this for later, if there's more on, the more general topic to get into, because I think this is a rather big topic. But I am kind of, because I think about this a lot. I've talked about this on this podcast a lot. I'm curious for your take, kind of as a Christian, how do you sort of, because obviously Bronze Age mindset is, quasi-pagan. I'm of the opinion that there's a lot of value to offer non-pagan traditions as well. The vitalism is something that I think can be transferred, but I do want to kind of get your general thoughts on, what, and I'm sure you've written about this. There's probably stuff you've said about it that I haven't read.
That's
but
okay.
Yeah, like how Bronze Age mindset can be applied in a more traditionally Judeo-Christian sort of outlook.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of threshold response is that, leaving aside whether Christianity has a role in the future society, we'd be hugely better off if we were ruled by a society, a Bronze Age mindset society that didn't provide any political role for Christians, among other reasons, because Christians would fundamentally have much more freedom than they do now. I mean, you can make counter-arguments to the contrary. You can say former pagan societies persecuted Christians, but I think in practice that wouldn't be the case if Bronze Age mindset types came to power. I think that fundamentally, and the reverse of that is true as well. That is, a society run by Christians, which is certainly the type of society that I favor, as well as a direct political role for Christianity. A society like that doesn't need to run around persecuting pagans. The idea of the virtuous pagan is something that has a long-standing kind of pedigree in Christianity. Admittedly, most of the time when Christians talk about virtuous pagans, they're talking about people who are dead 1,000 years before, not the people who were their citizens at the current time. So the actual practice of dealing with virtuous pagans in your midst might be more difficult to administer. But again, because pagans of the Bronze Age mindset type are infinitely preferable in terms of societal corrosion on pretty much on every other metric to modern day leftists, I think that's a problem that could be relatively easily managed.
Yeah. And that's what Bap himself always says. He never, well, he sometimes criticizes Christianity, but he rejects any sort of group attack on Christians, has many Christian friends. And I'm broadly in agreement with you that there's, I think, a lot of that these people are basically on the same side politically now, and it's not even just like a convenience of the times. I think it actually could be, in perpetuity. There's a give and take.
Yeah, I think you can have if you strip down the size of the federal government, so you had much more subsidiarity and localism. I think that you might have areas that were pagan, areas that were Christian, which sounds kind of silly when you say it, but it is entirely feasible. I think those two types of communities could act together in solidarity within a broader nation, unlike leftists who simply have to be expelled.
Absolutely. I mean, to the extent that, your governing philosophy encourages human flourishing and the flourishing of families, I mean, obviously, religion is important to people, but, family formation and healthy living is probably the ultimate judge of whether your society is, fruitful or not.
Yes.
And I mean, I think that Baps prescriptions, though I think they, to some extent should be read tongue in cheek, as you suggested in your review, they, would lead to a healthier society, as would a society guided by Christian nationalism. And, both can, potentially work hand in glove and, in fact, to some extent currently are. So the proof is in the pudding in some sense. I wanted to just go back to what you said initially about your initial reading of Bronze Age mindset and how, you've kind of changed your opinion, because I had a similar experience in that, I mean, it wasn't exactly that I disagreed with it so much as more, I just, I was not as online. It was like 2018 when I read it. And I was just like, what is this? This is really weird. This is really, I'm like, but, I think to a certain extent, and I think we all have it in this space right now, but if you are a normie, you do need some level of internet education to appreciate that Bronze Age mind, because I recently reread it and I realized this is a tremendously well-written book. This is, a very, on many levels, it hits all of these notes, and it demonstrably is, a product of a good author. And I mean, that's something that is maybe not immediately obvious to people who are not very online.
Yes.
But, I think it's something that, to the extent it's a kind of not an in joke for us, but it's something that we can all bond over. We all understand why Bronze Age mindset is great. That proved very useful, I think, because across the frog or whatever you want to call it spectrum, we all kind of understand, this was a triumph. And that's a unifying tool. and
absolutely.
emblem.
And as as Matt says, the 5 years, 6 years later, it's still very popular. I mean, I don't know what the exact sales figures are, but it's certainly something that's a big part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, maybe moving on to from we've discussed these three novels which are emblematic of this current moment, but their role and right-wing literature's role in what we call the culture war, which recently on your episode with Last Things, you briefly touched on Curtis Yarvin's Acorns for the Culture War, his prescription of a sort of not focusing at all on politics or action, but focusing on changing culture through to boil it down to something that is maybe too reductive, through parties. So your response to that, if I recall, on LT's pod was something to the effect of, yes, that's important, but also action is important as well. So
that's probably a fair characterization, though I can't remember. I mean, that response is conditioned to a certain extent by Yarvin's overall philosophy, which, while I think Yarvin has done a lot of good work, his relatively recent output typically revolves around variations about nothing matters and what if it did, and you're a hobbit, not a dark elf like me, who's really part of the future ruling class, and you get the suspicion that he really wants to be accepted by the present ruling class, thus making himself a fully fledged dark elf. That is, his history is terrible. I mean, I'm the author. I mean, look, I've met Yarvin repeatedly times, and I like him fine, and we travel in the same circles and so on. But I'm the author of what's probably the most trafficked hit piece on Yarvin on my blog, also from like 4 or 5 years, where I basically dissect his philosophy. And one of my complaints about Yarvin is that he doesn't actually know any history. He says he knows history because he yanks out a bunch of books, but if you actually ask him historical questions, he doesn't know any history. I mean, he knows a few things about very narrow things that he's dug out to wave around, but even those he doesn't actually usually come out with an accurate analysis of. And so he uses that to say, well, nothing is ever going to change unless the people in power decide to change it. And by the way, did you know that communism ended in Eastern Europe because people wanted blue jeans? Which is totally false. And it's just not a very persuasive kind of thing. So I guess, I mean, to reiterate, not to sound like Rebecca, but sure, like, parties and culture are extremely important. Culture more in the literature sense that we already discussed, but parties for the sense of like forming a group of people who know each other, like the Natal Conference. But those things, as an end in themselves, are basically a way to diffuse the energy that's built up in the right-wing movement, and that's, I think, the potential problem with that tech.
Yeah, I mean, so like obviously at many of these parties, I mean, and this is something we've talked about on New Right quite a bit. And I mean, I mostly see it as an asset, but I can see how it could be viewed as a liability as well. You have, artists, as we said, if you're to be a good artist, you need freedom. You need to be able to express the truth. And so if the right is the faction of truth, the right is going to attract the artists. So at many of these events and such, you do have like a real kind of like class of artists attending who, I don't think are exceptionally right wing, except in believing that not willing to, countenance obvious lies. Right. Which, I mean, that's a start, certainly.
I mean, I think the ferment is important. I don't go to parties. I mean, I don't go to these kind of parties, and I almost go to no parties if I can help it. Sit on my giant compound, oiling my gun. That's what Guardian said. But I wonder sometimes if, like, who else is at these parties? Historically, parties with artists that are influential have people from other segments of society. You have a variety of people. You typically have rich men who are looking to hook up with artsy women while their wives stay home. I'm not encouraging that behavior, but that's just the reality. And so those rich men are influenceable by artists, and you have a ferment going on. I get a little bit of impression that there's all these people are too similar to each other to have a real impact. That's not to say they shouldn't get together and do things and talk things and create art and so on. But I wonder whether these things are likely to have a broader societal impact. And maybe last February, a guy from the Epoch Times contacts me. You know, the Epoch Times, it's the Falun Gong.
Sure.
I mean, I subscribe. I generally support them. I mean, they're always banging on about the Chinese communists because they hate them so much. But he wanted to do an interview, and he did do an interview with me. But it was going to be a point counterpoint talking about some of these parties in New York that were happening. This whole scene. Now, the article has never come out. I don't know why. Maybe I was just too awesome. But it's the way he described these parties. I don't know. I wasn't sure that they were going to have real impact. But then, you know, I wasn't there, so what do I know?
Yeah. No, I mean, fair enough. It, you know, certainly I'm always kind of naturally suspicious of the idea that everyone's going to get drunk and have a good time, and this is going to change the trajectory of.
Yeah, and I keep hearing things, not about the New York parties necessarily, but about, shall we say, social events in our general sphere where, shall we say, various forms of bad behavior are engaged in. This is a mistake.
Can confirm.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I just, it's not just that I don't approve of bad behavior, though I don't approve of bad behavior. It just, you know, creates a vector of attack. It's fundamentally unserious. It's one thing to say, I'm a dumbass leftist in the 60s, and I take acid and I write about it, and isn't this great? I mean, but those people were already those people were tools of the zeitgeist and tools of the powerful, not people who were changing the actual zeitgeist for the most part. And so for right-wing people to say, well, I need to, you know, drop a bunch of acid too, or whatever the bad behavior is, just isn't a productive endeavor.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly to some extent is also not right-wing. I mean, I'm not going to say that experimentation with drugs has an inherent political direction, but to some extent, you know, the loss of personal control, et cetera, is, well,
I mean, just like anything, being a slave to one's passions is inherently left-wing and not right-wing. And so when you take drugs, or, you know, consume alcohol in excess or whatever, you're becoming a slave to your passions. I mean, this is not news. I mean, the Greeks could have told you this, you know, or probably some other peoples even earlier. That's why it's not right wing to act in a debauched fashion.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've Dan and I both have attended some of these, and you know, I definitely see the perspective you're coming from with that, and I do think, at the end of the day, if it's super druggy, even if it started with good intentions of sort of being a more youthful, vibrant gathering place for people who've read Bronze Age mindset, that I do think it can go off the rails. But sort of like on a more positive note, sort of like we were talking about with the, you know, incipient literary movement of the right earlier, I think this notion of, you know, social gathering in Los Angeles and New York is still in its incipient stage. And I think there could be some good stuff. I think there is some good stuff that's come out of it. I think it continued. You know, docs risking aside, I'm glad that there are these, you know, principles of social gathering, that it's not just political, that it is sort of more of like a more general party atmosphere. I think it could go off the rails, as we said.
Oh, I'm generally supportive. Yeah. Absolutely. My only point is that you want it to be productive of things other than brief euphoria and, you know, casual hookups. So, right. You know, those things may be productive in a sense, but they're not productive with the larger project.
Yeah. And I've seen it go from firsthand experience. I've definitely seen it go both ways. I will confirm that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it certainly, to the extent that these, you know, gatherings are helping to like foster a community of artists who are, you know, free to express themselves with art that's honest and not, you know, paused, then that's like, I think that is a benefit.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, certainly
it may not be great art. And you don't want it to be explicitly right-wing art in most cases, even, right? Because that's just tendentious and tiresome.
Yeah. I mean, I think the principal concern here, and the other people have said this before, is always that kind of the anti-woke normie artists are going to kind of sap the right-wing energy of the actual people who started this, and they will kind of capitulate to get girlfriends or something of that nature, which is, I think, there's always a risk in any kind of movement in letting in people who don't share the basic values. That being said, I mean,
you got to try new things, and
yeah.
these things aren't even new things. I mean, it's well recognized that you need face-to-face interpersonal relations in order to build any kind of movement. So I'm certainly not down on it. That said, the chance of my accepting invites to parties, were any being handed out to me, which they're not, are though I should probably wangle an invite if I wanted to. I'm just not going to any of these parties. But I'm older too, so there's that.
I mean, fair enough. Yeah, you're mostly missing cheap beers.
Yeah, I can just stay home and drink cheap beer.
Exactly. I was very heartened to see that, because I knew we had this episode coming up, that yesterday on the timeline dropped the trailer for this Civil War movie, which, I mean, initially I clicked on it, I'm like, A24 is doing a movie about an American Civil War. This is going to be some some nonsense, I assume. And it seems I was quite right. They for anyone who's not familiar, are positing a future civil war in America where Washington, D.C. and the federal government is, this seems to be from the trailer what it is. I'm not sure yet. I don't think the details have been explicitly released, but that Washington, D.C. and the federal government is controlled by white right-wing Christians, probably. And there is a rebel alliance of California, Florida, and Texas who are waging a war to like take America back. So obviously this is exactly backwards, which is or not exactly, but in many respects backwards. And so this is, a kind of ham-handed attempt at, in my opinion, at programming and proper propagandizing. That being said, our guys are already kind of like picking out the kind of like based figures from the government, the government in the good sense, the based world government. And there's this one iconic scene where Jesse Plemons, who was one of the football players from Friday Night Lights, is he has these kind of like rebel journalists under guard, and he asks them, are you no, they say that they are Americans, and he then asks them, what type of American are you? And that has made the rounds, and that's something that like our guys are kind of turning into memes. And this kind of like brings up the whole process and the whole history of Hollywood producing movies and creating bad guys who later are the most beloved characters, and the characters that particularly our guys can relate to and champion. So I'm wondering what you think of, well, number one, what do you think of this movie? Number two, what you think of this dynamic of Hollywood, attempting to slander our guys, but actually managing to do quite the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, obviously seen the trailer, and I think this is, I think a couple things. First of all, I'm reserving judgment on the thing itself in terms of its tack, and I'll come back to that. The very fact, leaving aside the politics of the movie or what it's attempting to portray or what political angle it's trying to portray, it was, other people have pointed out, it's inconceivable that even 5 or 6 years ago a movie like this could have been made. I mean, everyone was making zombie movies at the time, and so things the zeitgeist is reflected in the movies that get made. Like I said, I'm reserving judgment on the politics of it. I think that, yeah, there's some indications in the trailer that it's kind of shit lib, but and yeah, you're right that can be repurposed. But fundamentally, movies don't set the cultural tone like they used to. And so you have all these people saying, oh, they're going to give $100 million to create this propaganda piece that's part of the plan and predictive programming. I'm like, sometimes there just is no plan. Most of the time, there is no plan. And we're in a kind of situation where no doubt this movie isn't going to be like a based right-wing fantasy about how the bad guys get theirs. But these people are, nor do these people typically care that much about making money. That's not what I'm saying, that they're going to make a movie that's out to make money. That said, I think that the nature of things has changed so in a way that creates unpredictable outcomes. So movies just aren't as important as they used to be. Monetarily, it's hard for a movie to make more money. The political situation is completely unsettled. So my guess is that the movie is going to come out and be more nuanced in terms of the way it applies to everyday politics. It won't map very well at all onto actual politics, and to a certain extent, that's probably a deliberate choice on the part of the filmmakers because you don't want it to map too directly. So yeah, sure, it sounds insane, like California is going to team up with Texas, but I think that there's a decent chance that the movie will be interesting to watch. People don't grasp how bad civil wars are in practice, and so maybe in that case, it's salutary. Nonetheless, I'm actually interested in watching it because it just fascinates me no end. I guess this is my core point. It fascinates me no end that this is something, regardless of what it says or who the villains are, that people now talk openly about. And you can counter argument that. You can say, well, they used to talk about zombies and the zombies haven't shown up, have they? Which is true enough, I guess. But it tells what's actually on people's minds. And this kind of idea, you would never have had a movie like this in the past. I think there is a famous movie, Yarvin actually talks about it a lot, dealing with a fascist U.S. president, some movie from the 1930s or 1940s. So this stuff, there are, and some amount of civil war or civil conflict. So it's not entirely unprecedented. But of course, the 1930s were also a time when there was a lot of civil unrest and conflict. Maybe that just proves the point that these movies reflect the time. That's, of course, a different question of whether the United States will end up in civil war, which I probably have opinions on too. But the movie itself, I think, is indicative of the underlying zeitgeist, and that's not really news.
Absolutely. I think I have a similar take on it to you. I think this movie is inevitable because because this Civil War talk and fantasy, not necessarily a positive fantasy, but the degree to which we have been thinking about this, on both sides for years, I think makes it inevitable that someone would make the grand, 2020s Civil War movie. What's surprising to me, or not that surprising, but I think I'm actually glad to see is that it's A24. Credit where credit's due. Obviously, A24 is another liberal Hollywood company, but I do think they tend to make more artistically serious products, and I think that will probably. Oh, the Ari Aster movies like Hereditary and Midsummer and not even the ones I'm vouching for, but they really got on the map with Moonlight, which won the Oscar, LGBTQ movie. I'm not necessarily saying I like that one, but just A24 is kind of like the golden child of like indie studios, so to speak, and they make a lot of more artistically serious types of movies. There's probably other great A24 examples I'm not thinking of. Dan, I don't know if you have any favorite A24 movies, but
not off the top of my head. I think those are the ones that I associate with A24 that you just mentioned.
I'll think of some other ones. Lots of movies, but anyway, Amanda Milius of all people kind of has, talked about the modern state of movies and how it's super woke, but she's kind of pointed to A24 as just kind of the standard bearer in terms of quality, I think. And I think,
said anything about the trailer?
I'm sure she has. I haven't checked. I can go do so now, but I'm sure she has stuff. And Milius is an interesting person to bring up because another example of movies, and I actually haven't seen this movie. It's kind of blasphemous that I haven't, perhaps, or silly that I'm bringing it up because I haven't, but Red Dawn, which of course is a right-wing movie by John Milius.
Red Dawn? Oh my gosh.
I've never seen Red Dawn. It's just
podcast run.
I know. It's like one of those things.
Well, I've seen it. So we're half half Red Dawn here.
Well, you guys have both seen it, so am I wrong, or is that
I
sort
saw
of
it in the theater.
nice? Yeah. Is it?
There we go.
Is it broad? Could it broadly be compared to what the Civil War movie looks like? It's like,
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
like a kind of,
Sure. It's
serious.
probably Civil War, but broadly.
Yeah, like a look at actual current events, something that was very much in the zeitgeist, and being willing to go there in terms of trying to show what that would actually look like. I view it as part of that tradition, and I think it's interesting. Yeah, I agree with your point. I think it's not going to be a right wing movie, but it may not be as like left wing as would meet the eye. I think it's going to be revealing of kind of what's on people's minds. And yeah, I do think, obviously, if there was a civil war, it would probably be California against Texas and Florida more so than siding. So obviously, they're purposely diverging from reality. It's just, yeah, I think there's this inherent drive to express something that's so much in the zeitgeist. And I think it will be revelatory when it comes out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a military guy. I don't have any insights into it, but it doesn't. The trailer doesn't seem to depict the way an actual war would go. I mean, actual war would be cutting off the infrastructure and supplies to cities, rather than moving cross country to grab Washington kind of thing. I mean, it doesn't make that. This isn't 1945, right? But again, it's a movie, so we'll see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and the other thing I was going to say, I've talked to some would-be movie makers on their rightward side of things, and I'm almost glad that's going to be made from a slightly more left-wing perspective, because I think I've heard people talk like, got to make the new version of Red Dawn in this, and I think, and if it was made by, and I'm not even trying to diss, I'm glad that Ben Shapiro is making movies, honestly, even though a lot of them look bad. I'm glad that's happening, but I do think the whatever his company's is called version of the movie would do more harm than good if it was like the righteous right-wing takeover. No, I'd rather actually see the other side's version at least first.
Yeah, right. People who are interested in Civil War and are preparing for Civil War or buying guns or whatever, I mean, they're going to do that regardless of what the movies say. Ben Shapiro's movie, A24's movie, people who are in that mindset are going to do what they're going to do. Whether that's a wise idea is a different question. But I mean, obviously, buying some amount of guns is always a wise idea. But do you have to have the night vision gear and all this other stuff that people buy? Well, maybe you do. Probably not. You'll probably die with it in your closet. But those people aren't focused on the movies.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, I think, a point that I mentioned toward the end, our guys repurposing stuff anyways, that is, I think very, regardless of what perspective this comes from, the idea that they have imagined a sort of kind of, I mean, essentially the presidency, I mean, I don't want to analyze too much or presume too much, but they seem to imagine a Trump that gets reelected and never leaves and becomes a dictator. And to the extent that we have, a vision of a Trumpist army or something, that is, something that, obviously they mean to be, terrifying and derogatory. But, once again, they've, it's not for nothing, I think, that people online you don't see the left memeing their own creations because they're, as you say, they're, not rooted in reality. They're not true. They're not vital. But even when the left mistakenly or inadvertently creates a compelling vision of a right-wing character, it just resonates so strongly. And I mean, I think that that not only is a sort of sign of good health for whatever it is we're doing, but also a sign of potential future interest in an emerging right-wing film and media ecosystem that is truly artistic, and not to disparage Shapiro and his movies, but movies that truly do place the art first and the politics second.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right.
Well, maybe to move on from that to back to, I think, well, maybe we discuss this offline before the episode started, but we both attended the Natal Conference,
Yes.
which was, very well done. It, was organized in part by one of the founders of the Exit Group, which is, a group that many people on our side are familiar with, that helps men find, develop skills and careers outside of the corporate globo homo system. And, so very good organizers there. And it was a conference devoted to the raising awareness about the falling fertility rate in developed countries, and the various policy reasons that have caused it, and the policies that can reverse it. And it was great to run into you and so many others there. And what I was struck by was that this was a gathering at, in Austin, a major city, at a hotel that is, top of the line. And it marked a sort of maybe shift in the Overton window to have, perhaps it shouldn't be. Perhaps the Overton window had shifted too hard to the left, because these concepts, like, you would think that declining fertility, health problems, fall in, family formation and depression, you would think that these issues would be almost apolitical, that everyone would be like, oh God, we got to fix this. But
Elon Musk didn't show up, even though presumably he was up the road doing his Cybertruck reveal. This was a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
I think the most interesting thing to me, kind of politically about it, otherwise it was a big success, it was very well attended, and so on and so forth. And as you say, it had a very kind of high-end professional place and presentation. There was more of a gap, I think, politically, or at least policy-wise, among the attendees than is common at what might be coded as right-wing events. Because you basically had people who thought most of the problems to the natal bust revolved around, for lack of a better term, a traditional responses. You also have a very large group of people who might be called futurists or transhumanists, who are like, well, we need to have gene editing and artificial wombs and so on. I mean, I fall squarely in the former camp. The artificial wombs are a classic example. There will never be any artificial wombs, because this idea that somehow, like, well, we're kind of doing it in pigs. No one seems to understand that a human baby is bathed for 9 months in a unbelievably complex set of proteins and hormones, which no one knows anything about. And if you stick a baby in an artificial womb that doesn't have those things, it's not going to be real good at the end. I mean, no one seems to understand this. So the futurists are all, full of crap. But nonetheless, they were all there. We're all talking to each other in a generally civil way, and so on. And I think that's a very important accomplishment, rather than just have a bunch of people who already agree with each other on all the major points.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I certainly, to kind of recognize the same problem and be confronted with people who have solutions that are incredible and, would be, more deleterious than positive. That provides a kind of a teaching moment. And I mean, one of the things that I did notice, and I think, I'm blanking on her name. I think it was Diana Fleischman. She afterwards tweeted that she, is not right wing necessarily, but she, found all of the attendees to be, like, very affable and, friendly to women in a way that she didn't experience at liberal or left wing conferences.
Yeah.
And yeah, that, I thought that was, if anything, is a sign of a kind of like, a bridge being gapped, perhaps that's.
Yeah, totally. I mean, her speech was very interesting. I disagreed with the vast majority of it, but it was very well done. And that's the kind of things out of which actual progress is made. I mean, we do need Elon Musk to come up and hand out checks to all the attendees and tell them to, go make babies or something. But short of that, it's, I think, a significant step forward.
Absolutely. So I had mentioned in the notes that one of the interesting things that I don't think we really touched on that much in the Natal Conference, but this is a literature podcast, is literature for young men, and what is the state of the literary education of young men? I think Matt and I already have a good sense of the answer, and you do too. And but what should it be? What books should young men be reading?
Well, other than the ones we've talked about already, certainly, I think that this is a kind of a controversial opinion. I think what they call the great books are grossly overrated. I don't think they should be reading the great books, the ones that were popular in the mid-century, because most of those are just Enlightenment propaganda of one type or another. There's a few things in there that are worth reading, certainly, but generally speaking, the great books aren't all that great. And so I think that you should probably have a more curated reading list. I don't have a curated reading list, because obviously the next question is, when Haywood says, why don't you have you should follow the curated reading list, the next question is, can you email that to me? And I do not have a curated reading list, but I think that it's relatively easy to find out what current literature is worth reading. I mean, obviously you guys are producing a lot of analysis of that. I'm producing analysis of that. You can modern technology allows people to filter through the chaff pretty easily. I mean, the preeminent example of that is Bronze Age mindset. People find their way to it because it's being recommended by other people. In terms of older literature, I think it probably depends to a certain extent upon your interests and the things that you're good at evaluating. That is, maybe you should take a look at the great books for a few things here and there. But I don't think, for example, the average young man gets any benefit whatsoever out of reading the Federalist Papers. That doesn't mean the Federalist Papers is bad, and most of its political philosophy is quite good in a sense, or much of it is, but that just doesn't have any bearing on today. So I think in many ways you're better off focusing more on classic fiction literature for the same reason I identified earlier, which is it helps you understand what men and women are like and how they should interact. Because you look around you and you're like, well, this is not how men and women should act, either individually or with respect to each other, but how should they act? And I think literature and reading pretty much anything. I mean, you can read, your depressive Russians, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. I'm sure I'm not a literature guy, an expert myself, but there are many possibilities there that any competent list of important literature from the past several hundred years will enable you to at least give you a starting place.
Absolutely. I think especially, obviously literature for young men, adolescents, teenagers, but I think it's possibly particularly pernicious, the children's books and the literature for young adults that, seems now to be, especially, driven by these, questions of wokeness and what have you. So in my estimation, I grew up reading Chronicles of Narnia and stuff of that nature. Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Flies. I think in general, if you kind of stick to stuff that is pre-war or certainly pre-civil rights movement, you're in your advantage. You certainly have a better chance of the literature being morally instructive.
Yeah, we replaced all of our children's books with books from pre-1960, including 200 copies different. There's a series called by Random House, the Landmark series of history books, 50s and 60s. So we bought all of those. The book prices have gone up. But I will say that even stuff that has a reputation as being based can be completely worthless. So I did a review maybe a year ago of a science fiction book that's very popular among some people, Red Rising, which I saw
that, yeah.
And it's trilogy. It was actually a heptology, hexology, 6 books with two trilogies, but it comes across as kind of very base, like Space Rome. It starts off that way. It has a semi-famous opening line: "I would have lived in peace, but my enemies brought me war." But it's a total shit-lib book. Like there's it's, and that's before you get to all the trannies and homos down the road. You get like there's all these women in there who are just men, with female names and different parts. They're just men. There's no actual women anywhere in the book, and they all do, except for there's some women who are more men than the men because they fight better, they rule better. I mean, it's just a completely insane set of propaganda. And the books also go downhill. It's actually, the first one's not badly written. So they're like, well, Red Rising is pretty based because there's lots of fighting and people like, I mean, well, yeah, okay, but the underlying messages are all unbelievably pernicious. So yeah, even stuff that sounds that it should be good frequently isn't good.
Yeah, I mean, I think a great measure of whether a book is paused or not is if they have a female character who is very good at fighting and dispatches all the men.
Right.
Then like, well, that's certainly not true to life. That's not so what else is going on in this novel?
But I only bring it up because this book has a reputation as being right wing. And you see people say that, and that's just like overtly false. People are tricked into thinking that for a variety of reasons. In part because a lot of young people don't actually think. A surprisingly large number of young people think, well, of course women can fight as well as men. Even people who are right wing, they're like, well, because they've grown up on this diet of total lies. So I mean, and so I think there's right wing men like 15, 16, like they read this book and never occurs to them that this is just bizarrely false. It's like positing people with 6 arms. It doesn't make any sense at all. But they don't know that because they're like the archetypal fish that doesn't know it swims in water, just believe these ludicrous tropes that have been fed their whole life.
Right, and when it's a question of violence and war. This is kind of another issue, but when we're sufficiently abstracted, which is I'm not saying it's good that we don't have to fight to survive every day, but when you have a populace that's so abstracted from any of that, basic realities of biological and political functioning is that it's founded upon violence and war. Once you're abstracted enough from that, you can start to believe all kinds of lies like that women are as strong as men. And I think this is a broader issue that even affects people on the right. Interestingly, even within the military, you get weird propaganda. So
yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's a function of, it's right wing in a certain sense to want to defend yourself and to fight, and so to apply that to women is to kind of plays a weird kind of sleight of hand where it's like, well, that's right wing. She's defending herself. She's fighting, but actually, it's it's subversive because we know why, but yeah,
right.
I mean, on that note, that kind of I don't want to take too much of your time, Charles.
I got to go to a tedious and tiresome choir concert for my children. So
yeah. So if you have anything you want to promote, this is your time, this is your platform, please.
I write at theworthyhouse.com, and it's all free. I won't ask you to subscribe except to get notifications. And there's lots of stuff on there. You can waste a lot of time. I also do audio and video versions. The video versions are simply audio versions on video. So like 80% of the consumption is through audio. Somewhat strangely, I listen to podcasts obviously, but like surprisingly a large number of people prefer the audio. So all those methods of listening and reading are available if you're interested.
Excellent.
Absolutely. Check it out. Check out The Worthy House. There is a volume of book reviews that simply is staggering. It's impressive that you've managed to tackle all of these books, and I mean certainly a lot of potential novels and books for our guys to learn about and get into. So check it out.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you. Great to have you on.
It was.